Just when the monarchy seemed to have reached its fragile peace, Prince William made a decision that no one saw coming. In a stunning act of royal defiance, he personally excluded both Prince Harry and Prince Andrew from their long-standing positions as Counsellors of State. Within minutes, whispers turned into outrage. Was this the final break in the royal bloodline, or the cleansing act Britain had been waiting for? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The dawn air over London carried an unease that no one could quite name. Within Buckingham Palace, a brief but seismic statement was released. Prince Harry and Prince Andrew were officially removed from the list of Counsellors of State, a role vital in the absence or incapacity of the monarch. What should have been a routine administrative adjustment instead felt like an execution. News outlets scrambled to verify the story, their headlines exploding across every screen. William strikes first. The tone was unmistakable. This was not a collective royal decision. It was personal. As the palace gates remained shut, the media speculated wildly about what exclusion truly meant. Could they return? Were they banned from state influence forever? Questions poured in, but the silence from the palace was deafening. The only thing louder was the public's reaction, half cheering in triumph, half gasping in disbelief. To some, William had finally drawn the line that his father never dared. To others, he had crossed into dangerous territory, dismantling what little unity remained within the House of Windsor. The monarchy had survived divorces, scandals, and abdications, but this felt different. This felt deliberate. Hours later, insiders revealed that the confidential document had been signed not by the king, but by William himself, just before his father's scheduled health meeting. The ink was barely dry when whispers began circulating among royal aides. Why had William acted now? Why without the king's direct consent? One senior aide reportedly murmured, "This wasn't a son helping his father, this was a prince taking control." For the first time in decades, the monarchy's power dynamic had shifted not by force, but by foresight. Within the palace corridors, emotions ran high. Those who had served both Harry and Andrew for years felt the weight of betrayal. To them, the monarchy was family first, protocol second. Now, that family bond was fractured. They remembered the laughter of young princes in royal halls, the camaraderie of shared duty. But those memories turned bitter in the wake of this political blow. Many of the long-serving staff left in quiet resignation, unwilling to serve a house divided against itself. Outside, the public debate grew ferocious. Supporters of William called it the new monarchy, a modern step toward moral restoration, free from the shadows of scandal. Others saw cruelty in his decisiveness, accusing him of erasing rather than reforming. Yet William's silence spoke volumes. He neither justified nor denied the move. He simply stood firm, letting the storm rage around him. The act was both brutal and brilliant proof that he was no longer the compliant heir Britain once knew. And in that silence, London itself seemed to hold its breath. Reporters claimed that even inside Clarence House, King Charles looked uneasy, blindsided by his son's swift maneuver. It was said that he stared at the signed order for minutes, unable to speak, as if realizing that the power he had once nurtured in William had now grown beyond his reach. The monarchy had always been a symbol of continuity, but today, it symbolized something else: control. And so, as dawn faded into an uneasy morning, one truth became clear. The decision was not a spontaneous reaction, nor a moment of impulse. It was deliberate, calculated, the result of quiet conversations and strategic patience. Because while the world saw a shocking act of exclusion, few realized that this was only the beginning of something far greater. But as the dust settled over London, whispers emerged that this was not a sudden move. It was the final step of a plan William had been crafting for months. Behind every royal announcement lies a strategy, and this one had William's precision written all over it. Weeks before the public even heard the words "Counsellors of State," insiders say William had already gathered allies from within the palace to secure unanimous support. But his silence wasn't weakness, it was preparation. Every decision, every subtle meeting, was aimed at restoring royal integrity, even if it meant breaking his own family apart. From the outside, it appeared as though William acted overnight, striking with the swiftness of a man driven by impulse. But those who know the palace's rhythm understand that nothing of this scale happens without months of quiet maneuvering. The first whispers began when William requested a private meeting with Princess Anne and the Duke of Kent. Both had served the monarchy through eras of turmoil and transformation, and both understood the cost of decisive action. Behind closed doors, William laid out his vision, a monarchy free from compromise, free from the stains that had haunted its image for decades. Anne, ever the pragmatist, warned him that reform always demands sacrifice. Yet, she also saw in William something the family hadn't seen in generations: resolve, sharpened by pain. Soon after, legal advisors were discreetly summoned to Kensington Palace under the pretense of a constitutional review. The meeting was short, efficient, and chillingly focused. William sought clarity on his authority. How far could the heir act in moments when the king's capacity was in question? Could he preempt decisions if the stability of the crown was at stake? The advisors hesitated, but confirmed that royal precedent, though ancient, left room for interpretation. And interpretation, in William's hands, became a weapon cloaked in legitimacy. It was through this narrow corridor of law that he began constructing the framework for exclusion. Each document, each conversation, carried the subtle weight of future consequence. But beneath his composure, William's heart wrestled with conflict. This was not merely about titles or roles, it was about blood. He was a son and a brother before he was an heir. Every calculated move came with a shadow of guilt. There were nights when his thoughts lingered on Harry, the laughter they once shared. The promises of unity they made before life and fame fractured everything. Yet duty pressed harder. Harry's growing distance, his public defiance, and his overseas independence had made him unpredictable. William feared that allowing his brother to retain such a position could endanger the monarchy's credibility. It wasn't anger driving him, it was fear of collapse, of seeing everything their grandmother built unravel. The pressure from senior courtiers only intensified his burden. They urged action, whispering phrases like modern cleansing, a chilling reminder that the monarchy's survival sometimes demanded cruelty. William resisted the tone but not the logic. He understood that moral hesitation had cost the crown before. Now, with scandals still echoing from Andrew's disgrace and Harry's rebellion, he would not risk hesitation again. To save the institution, he had to appear unshakable, even if it meant becoming the very thing he once despised: a ruler who separates heart from hand. In rare moments of solitude, he recalled the Queen's old warning, words once dismissed as distant wisdom but now seared into his conscience. When you lead, you must choose who follows. The phrase haunted him, not as advice, but as prophecy. The Queen had known that leadership was a lonely inheritance, and William was finally discovering its truth. He had chosen his allies, secured his legal footing, and set his course in motion. The silence that surrounded him wasn't emptiness. It was the calm before history turned its next page. And as William quietly built his circle of trust, a separate storm brewed, one fueled by the two men he had just erased from royal influence. For Harry and Andrew, the announcement wasn't just an insult, it was annihilation. Both had carried the weight of scandal, but neither expected to be permanently written out of the monarchy's emergency structure. When the news reached them, one through a phone call and the other through a televised broadcast, silence followed. Then fury. It wasn't just the monarchy that was split, it was bloodlines burning at both ends. Harry first heard the news through a friend close to a senior aide. Not from William, not even from the palace. The message was simple, almost cold. "You're no longer a Counsellor of State." For a moment, he refused to believe it. After all, this was his brother, the man who once promised they'd rebuild the monarchy together after their mother's death. But as confirmation came from multiple sources, disbelief hardened into resentment. Harry had been excluded, not by scandal this time, but by blood turned against him. He was still a prince, but in name only. His voice, his influence, erased with a stroke of his brother's pen. Meghan, upon hearing the news, reportedly reacted with visible outrage. To her, this was proof of everything they'd fought against the hierarchy, the coldness, the unspoken message that they were never truly wanted. And within hours, the story had crossed oceans, igniting a media firestorm that no one in the palace could contain. Meanwhile, across England, another silence turned into an inferno. Prince Andrew, once the Queen's favorite son, received the news not through a private conversation, but by watching it unfold live on national television. Sitting in isolation, his reaction was immediate and explosive. Those close to him described it as rage mixed with heartbreak. To him, this wasn't just an act of exclusion, it was betrayal revisited. After being stripped of military titles, patronages, and public trust, Andrew had clung to the faint hope that he could one day reclaim a sliver of royal dignity. William's decision extinguished that hope entirely. The man who had already endured public disgrace was now rendered politically invisible. He was no longer a son serving his mother's legacy, but a liability exiled by his nephew's authority. Within hours, Andrew's legal team demanded formal clarification from the palace. What were the grounds for his removal? Was it procedural, constitutional, or was this a personal vendetta disguised as reform? The tone of their inquiry carried the weight of indignation, but the palace refused to respond beyond the initial statement. Officially, nothing more would be said. Unofficially, everything was being whispered. Rumors of Andrew's growing bitterness began circulating claims that he felt betrayed twice. First by the monarchy's retreat during his scandal, and now by the heir who had decided he no longer belonged in its future. As the media frenzy reached its peak, Harry's inner circle took matters into their own hands. Emotional statements began leaking from sources close to him, suggesting that William's actions were motivated not by duty, but by vengeance. Words like cruel, calculated, and unforgiving began appearing in headlines across the globe. Every article painted a picture of brothers divided not just by ideology, but by a deep wound that no apology could heal. For the public, it was no longer about royal titles or constitutional reform, it was a family war playing out on the world stage. Both men, humiliated and stripped of the last symbols of authority, considered fighting back publicly. There were drafts of statements, messages prepared for release to their respective audiences. But before they could act, royal counsel intervened swiftly. Lawyers representing the crown issued quiet but firm warnings. Any public response would be seen as an act of defiance against the monarchy itself. The message was clear. Silence was not only expected, but required. So they complied, though not willingly. Their anger was buried, but their resentment grew sharper in private. And yet, amid their fury and humiliation, one figure within the royal household quietly rejoiced, because this decision carried a second, hidden motive. Behind every royal move, there's a shadow this time, Queen Camilla's. Insiders whisper that William's decision was not only about Harry or Andrew, but about controlling Camilla's growing influence over royal governance. The exclusion weakened her circle, cutting ties to those she once relied on for leverage. What looked like punishment for scandal was, in truth, William's first strike in a silent power war within the palace walls. Tension between William and Camilla had been building quietly, long before the official announcement shook the monarchy. Behind the polished smiles and carefully staged family appearances, their relationship had turned cold. Camilla, once underestimated, had learned the mechanics of power, subtle influence, whispered alliances, and strategic timing. With King Charles's health increasingly fragile, her voice began to carry weight beyond ceremonial matters. Meetings once reserved for the heir were now occasionally held in her presence. To some, it seemed harmless. To William, it was intrusion. He saw a pattern forming a network of loyalties that centered around her, one that could eventually challenge his authority when the inevitable transition came. Reports soon surfaced of quiet disputes between the two, particularly concerning state council affairs. Camilla had advocated for the temporary reinstatement of Andrew to certain limited royal functions, citing his years of service and the need for unity. William, however, saw this as a dangerous regression, a move that risked undoing years of image repair. What appeared to be compassion in public was, to William, an attempt to preserve her influence by shielding those who owed her loyalty. Every defense she made for Andrew, and every soft word toward Harry, deepened William's suspicion. The monarchy, he believed, could not afford sentimentality when its survival depended on discipline. As Charles's health fluctuated, Camilla's visibility increased. She handled state matters, accompanied the king to briefings, and even began voicing opinions once reserved for constitutional advisors. For a monarch's spouse, such participation was unprecedented. It was at this moment William began to draw the boundaries more sharply. He understood that power within the palace was never handed down. It was claimed piece by piece, often in the shadows. And now, Camilla was claiming hers. By excluding Harry and Andrew, William had not just removed scandal, he had dismantled the foundation of Camilla's private support network. Princess Anne, perceptive as ever, saw through the public drama and stood quietly beside her nephew. She called William's move protective modernization, a phrase that carried both truth and warning. It was protection, yes, but it was also war disguised as reform. Anne understood what William was attempting: to isolate Camilla politically before her influence could root itself deeply into the structure of the monarchy. Together, they moved with precision, ensuring that every official justification sounded constitutional, not personal. But within those walls, everyone knew it was personal. The breaking point came with a private confrontation at Clarence House, one that insiders described as the most charged exchange since Charles's coronation. The argument, intended to remain confidential, leaked to the press within hours. Reports painted a picture of icy words, unyielding tempers, and a clear ultimatum. The monarchy would either move forward under William's leadership or risk being consumed by the same indulgence and scandal that once nearly destroyed it. For Camilla, it was a humiliation. For William, a warning shot. But even as he tightened his grip, he knew this was only the beginning. Because his struggle with Camilla represented something larger than personal rivalry, it was the reflection of a dynasty, fighting to cleanse its past before it was too late. But William's war wasn't against Camilla alone. His real battle was against the ghosts of scandal that had tainted the monarchy for decades. To William, this wasn't revenge, it was restoration. For too long, the monarchy had carried stains of disgrace that no amount of charity work or public smiles could erase. Removing Harry and Andrew wasn't about erasing family, it was about reclaiming legacy. In William's eyes, only a crown free from scandal could endure the next century. But righteousness often comes at the cost of mercy, and this time, mercy was nowhere in sight. When the statement was finally released, it carried William's tone measured, unwavering, and deliberate. The crown, it read, must reflect the highest standards of integrity and service. Modern monarchy demands accountability. The words were simple, but the meaning was razor-sharp. This wasn't just an explanation, it was a declaration of renewal. The message to the world was unmistakable. A new era of monarchy had begun, one where duty came before blood, and reputation outweighed emotion. Those inside the palace recognized the shift immediately. For the first time in years, William had drawn a line that could not be crossed, and unlike his predecessors, he didn't hesitate to stand behind it. The reaction from the public was immediate and thunderous. Polls showed overwhelming support for the decision. The majority called it brave, long overdue. For a nation that had grown weary of royal controversies, William's bold move was seen as the cleansing the crown desperately needed. Newspapers labeled it the Royal Reformation, while talk shows praised his leadership as the decisive break from an outdated, indulgent past. Yet, beneath the cheers of approval, cracks began to form in the silence of the royal corridors. The same decision that elevated William in the eyes of the people tore open wounds within his family that could never truly heal. Catherine, ever the moral compass beside him, couldn't ignore the toll it was taking on those closest to them. Behind closed doors, her words were quiet but piercing. "Have we gone too far?" It wasn't accusation, it was fear. She saw the cost of righteousness wearing on William's shoulders, the sleepless nights, the silent dinners, the look in his eyes that spoke of burden rather than triumph. But William couldn't allow hesitation to cloud his mission. He believed the monarchy's survival demanded sacrifice, and he was willing to bear the personal pain if it meant securing its future. To him, leadership wasn't about comfort, it was about conviction. Inside the palace, royal advisors began drafting a new framework of state protocols to accompany the announcement. The language was clinical but powerful. Any royal found compromising the integrity of the institution shall forfeit advisory and ceremonial privileges indefinitely. The words sent a chill through every royal household. The old rules of protection were gone. No title, no lineage, no sentiment would shield anyone from accountability. The monarchy was being reforged, one decree at a time. Across the globe, foreign media heralded the transformation. Le Monde dubbed William the monarch reborn. American outlets called him the modern Prince Britain needed but never expected. For the first time in decades, the Crown's narrative wasn't one of scandal but of resurgence. Yet, even in this wave of admiration, those closest to the throne knew the victory came with shadows. Every reform had a ripple, and every ripple carried consequences yet unseen. William stood firm, projecting strength to the public, but within the family, silence replaced warmth. What had begun as a fight for integrity was slowly becoming a test of endurance between duty and the quiet ache of isolation. But the world didn't know that this purge had one more secret layer, an unprecedented royal decree that would shock even the staunchest monarchists. While headlines focused on Harry and Andrew's downfall, deep inside Buckingham Palace, a sealed decree was being prepared, one that would redefine who truly holds power when the king can no longer serve. Drafted by William, co-signed by Anne, and witnessed by royal legal authorities, it marked the quiet transfer of emergency authority to a new generation and left Camilla completely out of the loop. As the nation dissected the fallout from William's purge, another storm was brewing, this time within the palace itself. Away from cameras and courtiers, secret meetings were being held under the guise of constitutional review sessions. But those few aware of what was unfolding knew the truth. This was no simple review. It was a structural shift, an internal rewriting of royal power that would change the monarchy's balance forever. The health of King Charles had become a growing concern, and his temporary absences from state functions gave William and Anne the perfect opportunity to formalize a contingency plan. On paper, it was about continuity. In reality, it was about control. William and Anne, bound by both loyalty and pragmatism, shared the same conviction. The monarchy needed a future secured from the influences that had destabilized it for decades. Together, they worked quietly with royal legal advisors and constitutional experts, crafting a decree so detailed that it would withstand any political or familial challenge. The plan would designate them as joint emergency executors of state authority should the king be unable to perform his duties. It wasn't a coup by name but by intent. It was the monarchy's quietest power shift in generations. Every signature on that paper carried the weight of a throne, and every line written was chosen with surgical precision. Charles's condition during this time worsened noticeably. Those close to him described him as pale, withdrawn, and often fatigued. His schedule was reduced. His public appearances were brief and calculated. Behind the scenes, doctors urged rest, while advisors shielded him from stress. But for William, this only heightened the urgency. He feared that the monarchy's stability could collapse in a single moment of indecision if Charles's health faltered at the wrong time. And with Camilla's growing assertiveness, the window for action was closing fast. Camilla, ever alert to the undercurrents of power, began to sense that something was amiss. The usual channels of information had gone quiet. Her trusted aides kept out of high-level briefings. By the time she learned of the document's existence, it was too late. The signatures had already been placed, the wax seals pressed, and the copies stored in both the Privy Council archive and Windsor's royal vault. Her fury, though silent in public, was unmistakable behind palace doors. She viewed it as a betrayal, not just by William, but by Anne, who had long maintained an air of neutrality. To Camilla, this wasn't a constitutional formality, it was an act of erasure. Catherine's discreet visit to Windsor around this time did not go unnoticed either. Courtiers whispered that she had carried not comfort but counsel, playing a quiet role in ensuring the document's legitimacy. Her presence lent the operation an air of stability, reinforcing the narrative that this was an act of duty, not rebellion. William's inner circle knew what they were doing would be controversial, but they justified it as necessary, a safeguard for the monarchy, not a power grab. When the ink dried, those who had witnessed the document began referring to it by an unspoken title, the Quiet Coup. It was a move that ensured the future would be guided by William's steady hand and Anne's integrity rather than the unpredictable tides of personal ambition. Yet, no matter how calculated the motives, there was no denying the enormity of what had been done. The crown's destiny had been subtly redrawn without the king's consent, and when the king finally discovered the document's existence, what followed was not approval, but heartbreak. King Charles had always believed in forgiveness, but even a monarch's heart has limits. Upon discovering William's decree, his world shattered. The son he trusted had moved faster than the father could comprehend. Torn between paternal love and royal duty, Charles faced his cruelest moment: to either endorse his heir's ruthless efficiency or challenge him and risk the monarchy's unity. For the first time, the crown felt heavier than ever before. The revelation struck him like a silent betrayal. Alone in his study at Balmoral, Charles read through the decree that bore his son's signature and Anne's seal. It was meticulous, deliberate, and undeniably strategic. A document that shifted the monarchy's internal balance of power away from him. His hands trembled not from age, but from disbelief. How had William done this without his knowledge? The answer, he realized, lay in the very thing he had always admired in his son, his decisiveness. Yet now, that same decisiveness had left him feeling replaced, diminished, and haunted by the possibility that the crown no longer belonged to him in spirit, even if it still rested upon his head. In a moment of deep uncertainty, Charles summoned an emergency meeting at Balmoral. Only his closest advisors, Anne and Camilla, were present. The air was thick with tension as Charles read portions of the decree aloud, his voice steady but charged with restrained emotion. He demanded answers, but William, composed and unflinching, simply replied that it was a precaution, a necessary step to protect the monarchy's continuity. The words stung more than they soothed. To Charles, they sounded less like reassurance and more like justification for disobedience. The king had spent a lifetime waiting for his place, upholding traditions, and now, as he neared the twilight of his reign, his own legacy seemed to be slipping away into his son's shadow. Later that evening, he confided in Camilla, the one person who had always stood by his side through scandal and scrutiny. She listened intently before offering her view. "If you allow this to stand, you surrender your crown in all but name." Her warning was laced with emotion, but sharpened by fear. She urged him to resist, to remind his son who the reigning monarch truly was. Yet Charles knew that defiance came with its own peril. To challenge William now could fracture the institution he had sworn to preserve. It was the cruel irony of leadership. He could either fight for control and risk chaos, or yield in silence and ensure stability. Princess Anne, however, saw things differently. In a rare moment of candor, she defended William's actions, calling them visionary leadership. Her loyalty to both father and nephew placed her in an impossible position, but her reasoning was clear. The world was changing faster than tradition could keep up, and William's decisiveness might be the only thing that could keep the monarchy alive in the decades to come. Charles listened, his expression unreadable, torn between pride in his son's strength and pain over his apparent lack of restraint. The confrontation that followed between father and son was one the palace would never acknowledge, but would forever whisper about. Charles, weary but resolute, asked, "Did you not trust me enough to speak first?" William's reply was cold but sincere. "I trusted the crown, father, and that meant acting before the world saw weakness." The words hung in the air like a confession and a verdict all at once. In that moment, Charles saw not rebellion, but reflection. A reflection of his own ambition, his own fear, now wielded by the next generation with even greater precision. In the end, he did what monarchs have always done when faced with impossible choices. He compromised. Charles reluctantly approved the decree, signing his name at the bottom of a document that symbolized both continuity and surrender. He told his advisors it was for the good of the crown, yet his tone betrayed the sorrow behind the words. The signature that once represented authority now felt like an act of resignation. Later, behind closed doors, he confided to his most trusted aide, his voice heavy with resignation. "History will remember this day, not for what I did, but for what I could not stop." But while the king signed for peace, the emotional fracture within the family deepened into something darker, something no royal press release could repair. As the world learned of William's exclusion of Harry and Andrew, shockwaves tore through royal circles. Cameras captured every uneasy glance, every silent dinner, every unspoken resentment. The monarchy stood taller but colder. What began as a bid for strength had turned into a kingdom ruled by quiet grief. The nation applauded, but inside the palace, love was dying behind gilded walls. The public reaction was immediate and divided. To some, William's decision was an act of necessary reform, a brave, unflinching move that finally brought accountability to an institution long weighed down by tradition and scandal. To others, it was a cold reminder that the monarchy, at its core, was still capable of sacrificing its own for the sake of survival. Headlines painted William as both savior and executioner. Commentators debated endlessly whether his leadership was modernizing the crown or eroding its very soul. The applause from the outside world grew louder, but inside Buckingham Palace, the echoes of pain grew unbearable. Harry's silence did not last long. Though his official statement never came, a heartfelt message shared online was widely interpreted as an indirect response. It spoke of the ties that bind and break us, and the love that endures even when the door closes. It wasn't defiance, it was sorrow, wrapped in restraint. Yet, between the lines, the world sensed his anguish. For millions who had followed his journey, it was a heartbreaking reminder of a brotherhood that once represented hope. In the public's eyes, this was no longer a royal dispute. It was a tragedy of blood and duty, colliding with the world watching every fracture unfold. Prince Andrew, on the other hand, disappeared further into isolation. The humiliation of his final exclusion left him bitter but broken. Gone were the quiet attempts to re-emerge in public life. Gone was the illusion of future redemption. Those close to him described a man who had accepted invisibility as his punishment. The title he once bore with pride now felt like an anchor he could never escape. His silence, unlike Harry's, carried no poetry, only resignation. Camilla, too, began to retreat, withdrawing from several royal engagements under the guise of health and rest. But insiders knew the truth. Her isolation was self-imposed. The fractures within the royal family had reached even her chambers. She had fought to maintain a sense of unity amid the chaos, but William's rising dominance left her feeling cornered. To her, the monarchy's new order was not rebirth, it was exile in disguise. The woman once dubbed the power behind the throne now found herself watching from the sidelines as the very institution she had helped preserve evolved without her. Catherine, caught between loyalty and love, became the silent bridge in the storm. While her public grace remained impeccable, those closest to her knew she carried the weight of two worlds. Behind the scenes, she made discreet efforts to reconnect William and Harry through carefully timed calls and messages. Though her attempts brought no resolution, they revealed a truth long buried under duty. Catherine's compassion remained the monarchy's last ember of warmth in an otherwise cold dynasty, and through it all, William stood firm. He continued his duties with military precision, greeting dignitaries, unveiling charities, and representing the crown with calm stoicism. Yet behind his composure lay exhaustion, an heir who had traded comfort for control, love for loyalty, and peace for preservation. The price of power was no longer abstract. It lived within him, in every sleepless night and every strained conversation. His triumph was undeniable, but it was drenched in sorrow. He had restored the monarchy's image, but at the cost of its heart. And yet, even as the royal facade gleamed brighter than ever, a final secret remained, one that could unravel everything William fought to protect. In the end, every royal decision has its reckoning. Behind locked doors, William finally confronted the cost of his actions, not from his family, but from the very institution he sought to save. Old alliances crumbled, forgotten letters resurfaced, and as the nation celebrated its purified monarchy, William realized that removing the tainted had come with a haunting price: his own humanity. The weeks that followed were filled with quiet ceremony and louder silences. William's reforms had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Public confidence soared, approval ratings climbed, and the monarchy once again appeared untouchable. The narrative of renewal, the new House of Windsor, dominated the global press. Yet beneath the golden veneer, something vital had fractured. The connections that once made the royal family human were dissolving one by one. Charles had grown distant, retreating into his work and his solitude, his trust in his son shaken beyond repair. Conversations between father and son were brief, formal, and stripped of emotion. What once had been mentorship had turned into monarchy's most polite form of estrangement. Harry remained a ghost spoken of only in past tense, referenced with sadness but never hope. For the first time in his life, William stood at the peak of royal power and found no one standing beside him. It was Anne who dared to break the silence. During one of their rare private exchanges, she warned him with a calm that only age and experience could give. The crown gives, but it also isolates. Beware the loneliness of command. Her words cut through him like a truth he had always sensed but never wanted to face. William had built his reign on strength, on the unwavering pursuit of order, but he was beginning to feel the emptiness it carried. The laughter that once filled the palace halls was gone, replaced by protocol and planning. Even success had begun to feel sterile, clean but cold, perfect but hollow. Catherine saw it long before he did. The distance that now defined their family life weighed heavily on her. The strain between father and son, brother, and husband and wife became unbearable. Her calm exterior, always so poised in public, finally cracked in private. In tears, she told William that the price of saving the monarchy might be the destruction of their family's heart. He listened, but he had no answer. He could not undo what had been done, nor could he step back from the image he had built. He was now the face of royal reform, the Iron Prince, as the press had come to call him, and every show of vulnerability would be seen as weakness. The public adored his discipline, his composure, his stoic silence. They saw strength. Only Catherine saw the man beneath the armor, quietly fading beneath the weight of his own ideals. The outside world remained enthralled. Every newspaper heralded William's leadership as a new dawn for Britain. International dignitaries praised his stability in a chaotic world. Even political leaders began to align themselves with his vision of modern monarchy. Yet, within the family, tensions simmered just beneath the surface. Rumors began to swirl about the king's declining health, stress-induced, some said, worsened by emotional strain. Charles's frailty became the palace's unspoken secret, a reminder that while the monarchy might endure, its members were still painfully human. As the months passed, William's days became consumed by duty. The man who had once sought to heal the monarchy now existed as its enforcer, unyielding, distant, and alone. The irony was cruel. In saving the institution, he had become everything he once feared: a ruler without warmth, a son without his father's trust, a brother without reconciliation, and a husband haunted by his own success. In the final days of that turbulent year, A private royal service was held at Windsor. It was a moment meant for unity, a symbolic reminder of endurance. But as the choir's voices rose in solemn harmony, William found himself standing apart from the others, his gaze fixed forward, unmoved. Around him were generations of portraits ancestors who had faced their own storms, and in that quiet, sacred space, he finally understood what they all had in common. They had all paid a price too high for power. The monarchy had survived, but at what cost? As history would soon write, this was the day when duty defeated family, and the throne gained its most ruthless heir. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.